Does our sound good? Can you hear?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay. Someone's report saying there's another big school board meeting tonight at 5:30 as well, so.
Oh, okay. I was gonna say attendance is slightly depressing at this point.
Oh, it's okay by me.
So it looks like it's mostly the project team at this point. I think we should give people just a few more minutes and then we'll get started.
So we're recording this, right?
Yes, yeah, and we're gonna post the recording to the webpage tomorrow morning, so.
Great. Well, it's about 5:35. Maybe we should just get going.
Yeah.
I hear there's a school board meeting tonight too that looks like it may be attracting a few other people, so. I'm sure people will be reviewing this in our recording later, so it's all for good. So welcome everyone. This is our Module 1 Use Regulations Public Open House. So we have a lot of information to present, and I think we just jump right into it. Since we have a fairly small group, I just want to introduce our team. We have Jessica Lawless, who's managing this project, Kate Meliscus, who's our shouldering a lot of the work on this as a planner, and we have Matt Myers from Myers, McCready and Myers, our legal counsel. Bryce, you want to introduce the Los Alamos side of the team?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Bryce Ternay. I'm the planning division manager here at Los Alamos County. We've also got Paul Andrews on the line, who is the community development director. And I can't see any other participants, so it's just the two of us.
Great. All right. So let's go to our timeline. We are well into this at this point. We are in our module 1, which is that white bar on the bottom there. So we are pretty much done with our module 1 and moving on to module 2. So cranking away on these and well on our way toward our code update. So these are our typical house rules, and then we highly encourage you to use the chat function in the Zoom screen. So I think you all know how to do that. And as we said, we started on this well over a year ago now, and we are hoping to bring the master plan to the council for final to submit and have a final version to council later this summer, and we really want to work on getting most of these modules done this year with some final updates and approval processes that will probably extend into 2022. All right. So what is this report that from module 1? It really establishes the goals and the general action updates for the code update, and identifies areas where the County of Los Alamos could be updated to reflect best practices, and outlines proposed structure for the code update. So that's our technical code report overview, and that is on our website. And then we have these 3 modules. And we're really trying to really do all the work within each module, complete that module, and move on to the next one. They will integrate will be based on the findings from our diagnostic report from the municipal code, and each of these modules will build off of each other. So these use regulations in module 1 will help inform the development standards in module 2, and then the administration and procedures in module 3. So, and comments on each module, we're not going to go back and revise each module. We will address those comments in the subsequent modules, the comments that we get from our outreach. So this is the table of contents for the module 1, and Jessica is going to take it over and talk to you in more detail about this. Take it away, Jessica.
Thanks, Will. So module 1 is, as Will mentioned, is all about the use regulations. So there's two kind of main pieces to the content of the module that we released on the 8th that's available on the website. The first is all about the zone districts, and the second is all about the use regulations. So the use index that's in the current development code, as well as any kind of use specific regulations. In terms of the key findings from the technical code review that Will mentioned earlier, there were several findings that related specifically to the zone districts that exist within the county today. So the way that the districts are broken up, there's approximately 39 base districts, base and overlay districts in the county. Many of these districts are very similar in terms of the permissive uses and the dimensional standards that they allow. And so we believe that because there's so many similarities that it indicates that this is probably an excessive amount of zone districts for a community the size of Los Alamos. And the issue with that is the more zone districts that you have, the more complexity it requires in the zoning code. So the kind of one of the key findings from the technical code review is that we really should evaluate these zone districts, evaluate this lineup based on guidance from the comprehensive plan, and looking at where there could be streamlining based on consolidations of like districts, eliminating districts that are really not needed or utilized. And then one of the other key findings was that the division between what is considered a base district and an overlay district is not very clear. So there's some instances where that could be clarified. And there's a lot of things that get regulated within the district now that could be regulated through a use standard rather than a zone district. So for those of you that don't know what zone districts are, so zone districts are really how we classify land within the county, and the district, which in a piece of property lives geographically, creates the uses that are allowed on that property, and it creates the development standards that are allowed. So whether you can do a commercial building versus a residential building, for example, whether that building can be 1 stories or 5 stories, that's all regulated by the zone that you're in. And this link here on the bottom of the screen will take you to the existing zone district map for the county, so you can access that later if you're viewing this presentation online. And then, like I mentioned, there's 2 types of zone districts. There's what's considered a base zone. So that establishes the primary type and intensity of land use for the particular parcel of land, as well as the development regulations, as I mentioned. But in certain areas of the county, there are these things called overlay zones. So for example, the wilderness areas are kind of a big issue in Los Alamos. And so there's an overlay zone that relates to wilderness recreational areas where there may be supplementary regulations on top of what is in your base zone, for example. So the base zone might be public land, but there may be some additional regulations that kick in if you're in a wilderness zone, and that's handled by the overlay zone. So in terms of the zone districts that exist on the ground today, the county has 39 of them. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of these are very similar in terms of the uses that they allow and the dimensional standards that are tied to them. So one of the major things that happened in this module is we went through and evaluated all of the districts on the ground, and with help of the steering committee, which we've been having bi-weekly meetings, we went through and kind of streamlined what is necessary for the county. So districts were either consolidated, as I mentioned, and that if consolidations happened, those were zones that were identified to be very alike in terms of uses and the intensities that were allowed within them. And if uses were not really utilized, they were potentially eliminated, and that only happened in 2 instances, and we'll go over those in just a moment. And we also evaluated whether we needed new uses as part of, or new districts as part of this process. So we're going to go through the kind of 3 buckets that we look at in terms of zoning. So we generally classify things as either a residential area, a mixed use area that allows commercial and residential to happen in one zone, or non-residential. So anything that is commercial or industrial but doesn't allow any kind of associated residential use. So we're going to start with residential. And if you look at this table here, all of the column on the left is the existing zone districts, and then the column on the right here is the new lineup of districts that we're proposing. And you can see in some instances there were some consolidations, and where that happened, it was mostly the result of what is called a planned development. So the county currently has, or the county had a zone district that allowed residential subdivisions to create their own rules. And that is a process that is no longer being carried forward. The existing code has said that past a certain date, the county is no longer accepting residential planned developments. And because that system is no longer being carried forward, one of the main recommendations for the residential districts is to consolidate the existing PD zones into the closest base zone in terms of use and intensity again. So for example, you have an R112 zone here that is very similar to what the planned development 3.5 district that exists is. And so the example here is we consolidated those into one zone. The only other instance where consolidations occurred outside of the PD districts within the residential category is in terms of the mobile home districts. So there were 3 existing districts that dealt with mobile home subdivisions. They were all very similar in terms of uses, and in 2 of the instances, the dimensional standards, so things like how far your building has to be set back from the property line and how high your building could be, were exactly the same. So those were consolidated into one manufactured home community district. In terms of mixed use conversions, there really weren't a ton of changes here. You have an existing mixed use zone. Again, the intent of that zone is to allow commercial and residential uses to happen together on one parcel. And that zone applies to areas that are outside of the designated downtown districts of Los Alamos and White Rock. That district is remaining exactly as it is. There is some guidance in the downtown master plan drafts that happened in phase 1 of this project to reduce some of the sub-districts that are happening within the existing downtown overlay that applies only to the Los Alamos town site currently. So the proposal here is to create one new district for downtown Los Alamos, and then to create an entirely new zone district for the White Rock Town Center that currently has no mixed use zoning as it is today. It's a mixture of commercial, light and heavy commercial, and a higher intensity multifamily residential. And so by guidance of the comprehensive plan that says that the zoning within this area really should accommodate for mixed use, the recommendation here is to create a new downtown specific district for the White Rock Town Center. In terms of non-residential conversions, the major changes were really about creating broader office, commercial, and industrial districts. As I mentioned before, these were areas where in some instances you had multiple districts that were really almost regulating exactly the same items. So for example, professional office and research and development were almost exactly the same district in terms of entitlements and in terms of uses. they had a couple of separate allowances for research and development, but they were mostly similar in terms of their intensity. So the recommendation here is to consolidate those. You had a light commercial and business district, a civic center, business and professional, which is C2, and a heavy commercial. The C2 district was really intended, it seems like it was a category that was intended to be utilized for the downtown districts prior to the mixed use zoning coming in. The light and commercial, the C1 and the C3 again were very similar in terms of uses and dimensional standards. So the recommendation here is to create a broader category that encompasses all of those uses in one area outside of the downtown. The same is true for both in light industrial and heavy industrial. The categories here, there were hardly any differences in terms of what was allowed, so to consolidate both of those into one. And then public land remains, and the only other district that was different here is the federal land district. Federal lands actually can't be controlled by zoning within the county, and so the recommendation here was to eliminate that district since we can't apply regulations to those parcels anyway. And then in terms of overlays, all of these overlays are pretty much on the books today. The historic overlay gets carried over as is. W1 and W2 deal with recreational wilderness areas and scenic wilderness areas. One of these districts actually isn't even utilized on the ground today, so we can carry those over as one district. Again, I mentioned the residential PD districts earlier, so the recommendation for these is that they get carried over to the closest base zone in terms of uses intensities, as we mentioned when we went over the residential districts, in areas where there are undeveloped parcels that are currently zoned PD. There's only a few instances where those happen. So where there's an existing site plan that controls the development standards and there's vacant parcels, those areas will actually be carried over through a planned residential development overlay. And so that will give an indication to any developer that in that instance, you have to go see the approved site plan when you're developing those parcels going forward. And then there's a special district currently on the books that just allows some development flexibility if you, for whatever reason, have an instance on your site where due to grading or kind of unique site conditions that you can't meet the development regulations of an underlying zone district, you can apply for what is called a special plan district, and you will get some kind of flexibility in terms of your development regulations for trade-offs in terms of public benefits, so additional open space or other kind of amenities that the county is looking for. So that will remain as well and get carried over through a planned development overlay. And in terms of the conversions, we have this map, the zone district conversion map, on the county webpage. So if you go to this link here on the bottom of the page, you can view what the existing zoning is on the particular parcel, as well as what the proposed zoning would be going forward. So it kind of just will carry over the conversions as we move through this module. How this all plays out in the actual module 1 and kind of in the overall framework of the development code is through these residential districts. So you have district summaries in the code currently that will show you what the name of the district is. There will be an intent statement for each of those. So what are the uses and the kind of development character that is anticipated there. As we move into module 2, you'll start to see these dimensional standard tables be populated. So what are the allowed minimum lot areas, what are the setbacks that you can do within those, and your primary building heights. Each district will have an associated graphic, as you see here, that kind of outlines what we mean in terms of, for example, if you have a street side setback, it's the distance from the property line to the edge of the building. And so there will be these descriptive diagrams that kind of illustrate what these dimensional standards are actually tied to, like a visual kind of aid. And then Each one of these districts in module 2 will also have district standards associated with them. So if there's things that happen within a property that is specific to the zone district, for example, residential agriculture has some allowances in terms of animal keeping and kind of animal husbandry that isn't allowed in any other district. Those types of standards will live in the district standards located here going forward. And all of those will be populated in module 2.
And I think just to tag on to that, you know, I think that last slide illustrates the importance of really getting consensus on the districts that we're proposing before we move ahead and start to do the more detailed work of proposing all of these dimensional standards. So we really want to make sure that we have these the districts consolidated in the right amount, and that we haven't missed any other opportunities for redefining or eliminating or adding districts. But I think we have a pretty good handle on that. But I do think that that illustration is a really good example of what we will be doing in the next module.
Thanks, Matt. Or thanks.
Thank you, Jessica.
Okay. And then in terms of the second kind of major changes that happened in module 1 are all about the uses. So updating the uses that are allowed within these districts. And there are a couple of things that happened in terms of why these uses were updated. So in a lot of instances, they were very specific and were not really related to what's happening in the market today. So uses were updated to bring them up to the times and the uses that are demanded by the market. In a lot of instances, the uses are really specific and could be consolidated into fewer broader categories. And a lot of the uses were also just things that are outdated and that aren't really happening anymore. And in those instances, they can be deleted. So the key findings from the code, the technical code review that we mentioned earlier related to uses, the county has what is called a use index table currently that outlines the districts, and we'll take a look at that in just a minute on one row, and then all of the uses that are allowed within those districts in another column. But the existing table doesn't actually list all of the zone districts. So one major update is that we need to bring all the use districts into the use index table. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of the uses themselves are either outdated or really too specific, and they need to be updated to just bring them into contemporary times. So this is the use table that I just mentioned. This is what it looks like. So the existing zone districts are here on the bottom so that people can kind of follow along and track the changes that are happening. So existing zone districts here, the zone conversions that we're proposing are up above here. And you can see, for example, where there's been consolidations, it'll list multiple districts, and that only happens, again, as I mentioned, in rare instances. But for example, in commercial, covers everything that was C1 through 3 is now carried over in the general commercial category. These are all of the kind of larger use categories. So anything that is related to household living is in this category. Anything that's more collegiate living kind of happens here. And then we move into, so this is all a residential category. When we start to move into office or commercial, in this case it's institutional uses, they'll be indicated by a red line, and then again the subsequent use categories. And all of the really specific uses are listed in this column here. So a single family dwelling, for example, is an independent use, as would be a townhouse. That's another example. And then all of these grids here will tell the user what is allowed within that district. So if I am in the residential agricultural zone, for example, RA, and I want to build a single family house, I would look into this column here, and this letter will tell me whether or not it's permissive. So a P in that cell means that the use is allowed. An S means that the use is allowed, but it requires a special use permit. So you actually have to go to a hearing to determine if you can do that use prior to being able to construct it. And A means that it's an accessory use. So for example, if I had a commercial development, commercial building and I wanted to put in a parking structure, if the parking structure says A next to it, means that it can only happen if it is associated with the commercial building. So if I wanted to put in a parking structure as the primary use and it is only listed under an A, that is not allowed. And then T is anything that would be allowed on a temporary basis. And the code will actually define the time frame for temporary uses, but generally it's somewhere between 90 to 45 days. And then red is just instances where there's new uses being proposed. And a couple other things to note on this table. So there's these things called use specific standards that we will cover as well. So for example, if I'm looking to do a cottage housing development, for example, and it's permissive in my zone, you will note here this table on the very right lists a cross section here that you're going to want to pay attention to, because aside from just looking that it's permissive, you will also need to follow any standards that are listed here in this column that are tied to a cottage development with regards to whatever zone it is. So it's not geographically specific. It doesn't matter if what zone district it is, it applies within all zone districts where a cottage development is allowed. The other piece to kind of note is that we have tracked all of the changes via footnotes. So at the bottom of this table, you'll see all of these footnotes here. Those will kind of help you translate what the use referred to in the previous version of the code, or if there's new changes, it'll track those as well. We wanted to give just a couple of broadband examples of where and how uses were consolidated. So for example, the existing code lists every kind of retail sale that they could think of at the time. So if it was a commercial use that sold building materials on a retail scale or a wholesale scale, those were listed as separate line items. Gift and souvenir shops, hardware shops, all of those retail uses were listed as a single item. And the issue when you have a system like that is, as I mentioned, a lot of these uses become outdated, or uses come up that you haven't necessarily thought of and that might not be included in this list. So one of the major goals of this update was to kind of create broader categories that encompass a whole slew of things rather than having to list them all separately. So all of these items get picked up through retail sales, and the definition here for retail sales is uses involving the sale, lease, or rent of new or used goods directly to the final consumer for direct use, but not for the purpose of resale, including but not limited to the sale of general merchandise, clothing, and other apparel, building materials, hardware, and similar consumer goods for other retail sales not listed as a separate use in the use matrix. So that's one example. Another example here is in terms of manufacturing. So again, the code lists every kind of manufacturing that they could think of at the time. And the recommendation is to, again, consolidate these into broader categories. So two of the new categories are light manufacturing, which basically limits manufacturing to activities that are primarily conducted within an enclosed building and don't have a whole lot of impacts on adjacent properties. The other category then is heavy manufacturing, and those are then activities and fabrication processes that do begin to have a greater impact on adjacent properties, and will probably have a higher level of scrutiny in terms of screening and buffering. So that's kind of the distinction there. And then, as I mentioned, the other kind of big piece that is cross-linked in the use table as well are use specific standards. So these are tied to uses that are generally considered nuisances. So things that have a direct impact on surrounding properties and are therefore have another level of regulation associated with them. A couple of examples for uses that have use specific standards within the code, the module 1 update, are particularly research and development facilities that have a certain level of processes that may deal with volatile substances or animal testing, for example. Heavy vehicle and equipment sales, rental, or repair. Oftentimes, if you're doing really heavy vehicle repair, those are uses that residences aren't going to want to have directly adjacent to them. Outdoor storage is another one that usually tends to be a bit controversial when they're adjacent to lower density developments, and then heavy manufacturing. So anything that has an impact on the adjacent property. And apologize. There we go. And then in terms of the types of use standards that you're going to see being implemented for those types of nuisance uses or the like heavier uses, in some instances they could require additional buffering to adjacent properties. In some instances they're going to require special use approvals, and in some instances they're going to be prohibited entirely if they're within a certain distance of residential zone districts. And depending on the use, that's either 300 to 500 feet. Another thing is that things like accessory outdoor storage, for example, could be entirely prohibited for certain uses. And then in some instances, they could have additional requirements in terms of design standards. So accessory dwelling units, for example, may require additional parking spaces for the accessory unit. If you have an outdoor storage area, there could be additional requirements in terms of screening. And then if it's a large kind of big box commercial store, for example, there could be things like additional facade articulation, and all those things are picked up with use specific standards. And that is actually all that we have in terms of the updates for major changes that are happening in module 1. And we kind of just like to open it up for questions or discussion items. I know we don't have too many participants, but the few of you that are here, is there anything you need additional clarification on, or any questions you have?
You have anything to add, Matt or Bryce?
This is, excuse me, this is Matt. I don't have anything to add. I think it's coming along nicely. I think maybe things will come up as we're moving through the next modules that, you know, maybe it'll help us think through some, like the first module, maybe we'll really start feeling a little more complete, and maybe some things will come up as we move through it, but it seems to be going well now.
No, well, this is Bryce. I don't have anything else to comment at this time either.
All right, well.
Doesn't look like we have anything in the chat either. I know zoning is a bit of a complex animal, so I'm not surprised that there may not be too many technical questions, but for those of you that are here, there's a couple ways that you can track progress on this project. So we have the project website, losalamosconnect.org. So if you need a little bit more time to digest all of the things we've covered today, you can go to this code update tab, and it'll give you all of the project information. You can download both the technical review, code review, and module 1 there if you haven't done so already. There's also this sidebar here that says provide input. And if you click on this link, we have a comment period that's open for the next 2 weeks. And so if you don't feel comfortable asking questions or commenting directly here, you can use this link and we'll get all of the comments there, or you can email Will or myself directly, and we're always happy to discuss the project or answer any questions there.
And I know that Bryce, you had forwarded some comments from a resident, and my sense is from reading the comments that he expected to see everything in this module 1, you know, that he was talking about the lack of dimensional standards, but I think it's just important to reiterate that the dimensional standards and the whole approval and administration process will come in subsequent modules.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Will.
All right, well, I guess we can take back some of our evening.
Yeah.
That was the fastest zoning meeting ever. Okay.
Nice job, Jessica.
Thanks. Thanks everyone who did come
Thanks, guys.
this evening. And, you know, just let us know if you have any questions going forward.
All right. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, guys.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
evening all.